I suppose the most exciting and important thing I've done in my career has been the TB, because here was this horrible disease for which half the people died and producing a lot of social misery and infection in families, and attacking it was obviously terribly important.
Tuberculosis held a powerful grip on the imagination, in fiction as in life. Consumption, a devastating, wasting disease, affected 500,000 people. Many died. Then, in the 1950s, a revolution took place. One of its leaders was John Crofton.
The commonest form is lung tuberculosis, but it can spread to all parts of the body. The very acute forms, which kill people very quickly, were 100% fatal. The ordinary lung disease was about 50%. Half the patients who got it died from it. So it was a very nasty disease.
The disease process inside the lung would erode and ulcerate into a large artery, and blood would pour out and they would cough this up and exsanguinate or drown in their own blood. And that was pretty nasty for everybody. It was very terrifying for the patient, obviously, but it was terrifying for the relatives.
There was fear that you were going to catch it just by speaking to someone.
Don't go to the house and drink the tea. Don't drink out of that cup.
Everybody was aware of everybody else's business. So somebody disappeared, and as I say, in streets it was quite common for people to disappear. But there was a stigma. There was a stigma attached to it.
Don't sit beside that person because their family have had TB.
Everybody around me was upset, particularly my mother, who had nursed tuberculosis in the 20s and early 30s, and everybody died.
John Crofton's interest in tuberculosis began during his wartime service in Egypt. Later, in Edinburgh, in the early years of the National Health Service, he led a team of doctors who showed that this terrible disease was 100% curable.
John Crofton, of course, was a great team leader, and sometimes he had too much energy, and he kept jumping up and down and making us all feel slightly exhausted. But we were so keen to get on with the task of conquering tuberculosis.
It's important to remember that TB is, of course, an infectious disease. Now, if you are very poor, you are more likely to get infected with a big dose of TB because you are living in overcrowded conditions. If you didn't have proper food, your defenses became poor. So you got more TB in poor people, but people of any type, any stage, could get infected.
Any of these people, without knowing it, may be harboring this germ, any one or all. That man, he spat. His spit may contain the germs of tuberculosis. The spit dries, but the dangerous germs remain alive, mingling with the dust. A gust of wind, dust in her eyes, in her throat.
In Edinburgh, TB increased dramatically during and after the war. Every year, 800 new cases were diagnosed, and untold numbers lay hidden in the community. John Crofton began work in the city here at Southfield Sanatorium. It still belongs to the National Health Service, though now it's a geriatric hospital.
I'm John Crofton.
Hello.
Used to work here way back.
Helen Ford.
As the first non-Scot appointed as Professor of Tuberculosis in Edinburgh, he relished the challenge.
I suppose I was a little apprehensive before I came. And of course I'd been warned to be terribly careful because I was a foreigner coming to Scotland. And one of my Scottish friends, very senior, said, "Don't open your mouth for the first 3 months." So I came with some caution. But I must say, I soon really became rather euphoric. I found it very exciting.
Southfield had been a sanatorium for 40 years. its treatment regime prescribed by Britain's first professor of tuberculosis, Sir Robert Phillip. Christopher Clayson endured its rigours when he contracted TB in the 20s.
First of all, rest in bed. I was allowed up for toilet purposes, but otherwise rest in bed. Old Sir Robert had declaimed, fresh air is the food of the lungs. See that the lungs be not starved. And that was the policy, summer and winter alike. There was no heating, except in the doctor's consulting room. He permitted himself heating there. And it really was pretty Spartan. 3 raw eggs a day. Have you ever swallowed a raw egg? It takes some doing. They're all right if you can swallow the egg without breaking the yolk. That's not easy. It requires a little glottal dexterity to do that. Stage 2 thereafter was graduated exercise. And then stage 3 was graduated work. Patients were put to various jobs. Working in the garden. I did a little of that myself.
Putting many people with infectious tuberculosis into sanatoria had a preventive effect. Whether it did good to individual patients is a little less certain, but one has to remember that many of the patients came from slums, they were malnourished and so on, and it probably helped a number of them to resist the disease, though of course many died.
There were a few more active treatments.
The diseased part is shown black. For this part to get better, the lung must be rested by a method called pneumothorax or lung rest. To do this, a needle is put painlessly through the wall of the chest, but not into the lung itself. Air from outside is let in so that the lung collapses like a squeezed sponge. Joan is being given her lung rest under local anesthetic. She doesn't feel it at all. Now her sick lung will have a chance to heal.
Nobody really knows how much good that did. Probably it did a little good, but perhaps not very much.
But just as the young John Crofton began his career in chest medicine after the war, everything began to change. In America, a new antibiotic had been developed. Streptomycin underwent trials by the Medical Research Council in London, and Crofton was offered a role.
I was a very junior doctor. I had to keep all the high-powered physicians' suite so that the patients came into the trial and the proper records were kept. The Medical Research Council was advised by a very good statistician, and he devised the controlled trial. And now this was the first properly controlled trial in any disease.
It was the first time that true scientific method was used to test a new treatment.
We had a series of envelopes with successive numbers, and when a new patient came in, you wrote on the envelope the patient's name. You then opened the envelope, and a card told you what treatment it was on. So there was less possibility of cheating.
The results of the trial were disappointing.
It was quite dramatically effective to begin with, but then a lot of patients, after a number of weeks or a month or two, developed resistance. Their tubercle bacilli became resistant to the drug, they relapsed, and many of them died.
To Dave Mitchison, one of the bacteriologists on the trial, it became clear what was happening.
We knew from work with cultures that perhaps 1 in a million of the bacteria present would be naturally resistant to the drug, the so-called mutant bacilli. These could grow in the presence of the drug. And in severe disease, you could get 1,000 million bacilli in the body. Perhaps 1,000 of these are these resistant mutants, and you perhaps only need 5 or 10 to grow up to replace the original sensitive population.
The challenge was to destroy those few resistant organisms which were responsible for the deaths.
Rather shortly after streptomycin, the second drug became available, PAS, and although it proved to be not anything like as powerful a drug as streptomycin, it looked as if it might be useful. So the second stage, with the Medical Research Council who'd done these trials, was to compare three things: streptomycin by itself, streptomycin plus this new drug, and the new drug by itself. And the combination proved to be more effective. There was much less drug resistance.
Two drugs given together made it more difficult for the bacteria to develop resistance to either drug. But TB was a resilient bug, and resistant strains would always be a problem. The disease was still killing patients. Now John Crofton's aim was to find out how best to use the drugs in his own unit.
When I arrived in Edinburgh, there were 400 beds for tuberculosis. There was a very big waiting list to come into hospital. And in Scotland in general, there were so many big waiting lists that in fact they were sending patients to Switzerland paid for by the NHS. And because there was great concern, I had very little difficulty in persuading what was then called the Regional Hospital Board, the NHS, to appoint 2 more consultants immediately and to agree that our group should take over the whole thing and reorganize it.
I was the last member of the team to be appointed, and I was the one who was, my special interest had been community care and the development of outpatient services and prevention and that sort of thing.
Patients waiting for hospital beds were seen at the TB dispensary, an old Presbyterian church in the aptly, if unfortunately named, Spittal Street. It was a bit grim, but TB patients were not supposed to be too sensitive.
I was told that until a few years before I arrived, at the top of the stair, which faced everybody who came into the clinic, there was a glass case and there was a boy in it, obviously a dead boy, dead a long time, and his lungs had been exposed, his ribs cut away so that you could see the diseased lungs and were on display. And I suppose this was to encourage patients to lead a blameless life and take their tablets and that sort of thing.
It was really quite difficult to believe. I mean, one very nice young girl who came to my clinic in London said that the consultant would come into the ward of all these beautiful young women. Of course, a lot of this increase was young women, and saying, "You're all rosy apples, rotten at the core."
I used to go on the ward rounds with Professor Crofton, and my most fond memory is the senior nurse carried a hot water bottle, and he always heated his hands before he examined the patients. Very much a gentleman.
The chilly wards of the sanatorium regime had continued. The drugs were a major advance, but the doctors were not yet ready to scrap this system that had been relied on for half a century.
We had them in for 2 to 2.5 years.
We were incarcerated in one room for month after month after month.
It was a long, long day, and of course they couldn't go out to the other wards.
Read and knitted, I think. I knitted. We had a wireless.
They weren't allowed to visit the shop or the cafe with their families, so it was a long day.
One of John Crofton's earliest patients in Edinburgh was David Simpson.
I hadn't been feeling too fit, and I'd had 1 or 2 occasions at night when I sweated very heavily, and that is a sign of TB. So I spoke to a colleague I was working with who was a radiologist, and he was delighted I'd raised it because he hadn't wanted to say, and he got me in front of an X-ray machine, and that showed that I had it indeed. I was on my own at that time with 2 small children. My wife was in a nursing home having our 3rd child. And I thought, gosh, this is dreadful. Is everybody in the family going to be infected? This was my bed. The ward was very much like this. The windows up there opened, and it was through there the snow used to come and land on top of me. And then along here there was a door which was left open in case it got too possibly hot, and windows, more windows up there. but I've not been in this room since 1953. It awakes old memories which I prefer to forget. John Crofton was very good. He had a lot of belief in what he was doing, and that transferred to me and I think to the other patients, and realised that things were going to be all right.
A third drug was now available, isoniazid. When the MRC ran trials of this drug, combined with each of the old ones, Crofton's team took part. But they found isoniazid resistance had already developed. This led to an important conclusion.
We had 2 patients who we found had been infected with an isoniazid-resistant bug, and then had isoniazid and one other drug. The tests took 6 weeks or more. By the time we knew he'd been infected with a resistant bug, he was resistant to the second drug. So then we started, it's much safer to give all 3 drugs to begin with. And to our astonishment, we found we were curing everybody who had sensitive organisms or weren't resistant to more than one drug when they started.
They had their answer. 3 drugs from the beginning. They carefully followed up all their patients and showed that they must keep up the treatment for at least 18 months.
Everybody else was using 2 drugs, and when we began to get such good results, and I analysed my first 2 years and found we'd had no failures of new patients, and said that 100% cure of pulmonary tuberculosis was a reasonable aim, everybody thought it was absolute nonsense. They didn't believe us. In fact, they accused us of fiddling our figures.
I suppose what they were really saying is you're crooks, you guys in Edinburgh. You know, you're not giving us the truth, and we didn't like that very much. But it didn't. I mean, we knew we were right, so we didn't get tearful about it or anything. But it was a bit puzzling.
At one of the meetings in the South, somebody said, "Oh, we know you say that," but somebody who worked with you said that when a patient isn't successful, you send him out of hospital and you don't count him. And I said, "By God, tell me what his name is. I'll have him for criminal libel." I mean, that's the sort of story which was obviously in the bars in London.
And any failures we had invariably could be ascribed to non-compliance. The patient had not been taking the tablets or the drugs as prescribed.
The drugs were not loved by the patients.
The streptomycin we had was injected, and it was quite as I remember it, a large injection. And of course it was before disposable needles. That sounds as if it's just a matter of hygiene and needles, but it's not. That a needle that's going in and out of people repeatedly, it loses its edge very considerably and very quickly. And occasionally somebody would shove in a needle which was slightly hooked because it had rammed through into the bone and got bent.
So one of my jobs in the morning as a senior student nurse was to do 45 intramuscular injections into the buttock of streptomycin. We also had to deal with abscesses. Because of streptomycin every day, you know, it was abscesses on the buttocks.
And this horrific stuff called PAS, which seemed to come every 5 minutes and was foul, really foul.
They often used to toss it out the window, and it discoloured the grass and discoloured the wall, so I hate to think what it did to their stomachs.
Either the drugs or the TB made them rather frisky with the nurses.
You mean oversexed?
But I think it was all good fun and light-hearted.
I'm not naming names, and I'm sure it'll be all right, but there was one woman on bed rest for a year, and she still managed to have a baby.
Although drug treatment lasted 18 months, not all that time was now spent in hospital. But even a 6-month sentence could prove a strain.
I really did miss my wife very, very badly because we were very close. And I think it was just the segregation was awful, but she could come and see me and we could catch up. And I think we wrote to each other every day, whether it was visiting day or not. But not seeing the children, and Mary, the youngest one, had never seen me till she was 6 months old. And that was quite difficult.
I was always thinking of, you know, young parents with young children and having to disrupt their lives, mothers having to come into hospital for months and months, or bread earners. understandably, we kept them in until they were no longer infectious. We thought they were safe. But about that sort of time, Wallace Fox and the Medical Research Council in Madras had done a very important research, and they showed that with chemotherapy, with treatment, patients ceased to be infectious after 2 weeks.
This was one of a series of important trials for the Third World run by Wallace Fox and his MRC team. With him on this one was Denny Mitchison.
A classic study comparing treatment of patients in sanatorium with rest, in bed with a good diet, or the classical forms of treatment, was compared with giving the same chemotherapy, the same drug treatment, to patients in their home where they had no rest, very poor food, went on with their work.
The Madras work encouraged the Edinburgh team to conduct a similar trial.
It was a bit of a job persuading people to do that, but we did do it. We did it in a randomized, controlled way, and showed that the patients living a normal life but taking their drugs did just as well and were all cured.
And after following up all their patients for 5 years, the MRC confirmed that families were no more likely to catch the disease if a parent stayed at home.
These were very important findings. What they did was more or less to abolish sanatorium and hospital treatment of tuberculosis. And this made such enormous savings in medical costs as to pay for all medical research, just not in TB, but all medical research for the next 10 years.
The change to outpatient treatment didn't happen overnight, but already in Edinburgh, the wards were beginning to empty.
As soon as we made sure that everybody, either on the waiting list at home or in hospital, was having good treatment, the numbers of new patients each year decreased by 58% in 3 years, which is vastly more than has occurred anywhere else in the world. So our demand for beds went down very rapidly.
This meant they could turn their attention to undiagnosed TB in the community, a particular interest of Jimmy Williamson.
It's now reckoned that every open case, every infectious case, will infect between 10 and 20 people every year. So that if you've got 100 people walking the streets of Edinburgh coughing up tubercle bacilli, that's 1,000 to 2,000 people every year that will become infected, some of whom will then develop the disease themselves. So in Scotland it was decided we would have a national mass X-ray campaign.
37 mobile X-ray units, the biggest fleet ever gathered together, have converged on Glasgow from all parts of the British Isles. Queues at the X-ray centres are many hundreds long, and in the first 3 hours of the campaign, over 2,500 people have been X-rayed at the 3 major clinics alone.
A few months later, it was Edinburgh's turn. Much of the equipment they used then has been saved from the scrap heap by the Health Service archivist Mike Barfoot.
Worked quite well. We're just going to know if it still works after nearly 50 years.
Let's give it a try, shall we?
He's also kept all 300,000 X-rays taken in the 4-week campaign.
There's a right lower lobe shadow. Don't know what that is.
At the time, the miniatures were checked overnight, and when an abnormality was found, a full-size X-ray was taken. The campaign was amazingly successful.
84% of the target population were X-rayed by miniature film. Of course, we had appealing to the venality of the citizenry. We had prizes which were based on lucky numbers. Each X-ray card had a number on it, a serial number, and every day there was a draw, and the lucky card, the people with the lucky numbers would get a prize. The first prize was actually a 3-bedroom house.
Right.
So it was, you know, there were...
So among our 300,000 cards in the shoeboxes, we've probably got the lucky winner.
You must have, if you've got all the cards, because somebody certainly won the house. At the west end of Princess Street Gardens, we had a big top. You know, it was actually a circus big top. I think we got it from Bertram or something. And in that were 2 X-ray machines, clicking away all the time, morning, afternoon, and evening. And overlooking that, hanging from the castle ramparts, was an enormous banner which said X-ray,
Yes.
1958. It really was a very exciting time. And we actually ended up with 460 new cases of active pulmonary tuberculosis. And that was the last dying gasp of the tubercle bacillus in Edinburgh.
And by now, all over the country, the sanatoria were closing. This brought to an end what had been a special way of life, both for the patients and for those who looked after them.
There were one or two people who were complaining about the advent of effective chemotherapy because they then didn't have to do these artificial pneumothorax and all these sort of complicated, highly skilled operations that we'd all been doing before. And there were one or two people who almost came out and said, you know, this is a retrograde step, curing all these people so easily without really much of an individual effort.
But I remember at the beginning when we said it's going to take 20 years and then we will all be able to put our feet up. Well, it wasn't the way it turned out, of course, because it was an enormous challenge in lung cancer and chronic bronchitis and the other respiratory diseases, which we moved steadily over into.
The change allowed Crofton to devote his energies to the University Medical School. He became president of the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh and was knighted in 1977. But it was only the battle with tuberculosis that had been won, not the war.
We've talked, of course, about Edinburgh. It took a long time, quite a long time, for this to be generally used in the UK, but much longer, of course, elsewhere. Even in rich countries, much less in the third world, where, because of poverty and TB was an enormous problem in most of them.
The danger posed by TB in the Third World had been recognized from the beginning. It was the main focus of the World Health Organization and the MRC. But the cost of long treatment with cocktails of drugs was overwhelming. Even with newer drugs, the bacterium was able to develop resistance. And then came an extra complication: AIDS.
The HIV virus attacks the most important cell protecting you from TB. And in a situation where most of the adult population is infected, and normally they keep it under control by using this cell, when the cell goes, the TB explodes. So in Africa and now in India, the commonest first sign that somebody has HIV virus, has AIDS, is developing TB.
In Britain, AIDS has not yet combined with TB to such a disastrous extent. But TB has returned to our cities, aggravated by poverty and homelessness.
On a world basis, at the present time, there are probably more TB cases than there have ever been in history. What is more, because of a lot of bad treatment, there's a lot of major problem of drug resistance. So there's a major risk that we get an epidemic in some countries, like the Indian subcontinent, of untreatable tuberculosis, which could then spread to other countries. So there really is a world crisis, and that seems extraordinary when 40 years ago we were able to show in Edinburgh that the whole thing could be controlled, and now we have a world crisis.